the conversations with Adi Shankaracharya and Mandan Mishra. Mandan Mishra, true to the Purva Paksh tradition, actually learned everything about Buddhism, if you like, and then critiqued it. I mean,
Correct.
people blame Shankaracharya for fall of Buddhism.
If Christianity had been purely an intellectual culture which appreciates criticism, if the Pope is honest enough to say that if I am defeated in a debate, I am going to leave Christianity, then that makes sense. Then you would expect a Shankarapita head to go and argue with him. But the Abrahamics never have that honesty, right? I mean, they are not basically about truth. They are about faith and their proclamation of what they already know as truth. So there is no meaningful engagement that can happen with them. Nature of invasions and the response, right? The other point is the magnitude of attack. The
Correct.
number of invasions, the complexity, and the damage done by each successful invasion that actually overweighs on us. Let us say that Panipat battle was there. People think Panipat had basically destroyed us and that was the end of the story. But that was not true, right? I mean, after that, we had rebuilt. Marathas had defeated British also. And at that time, Marathas had to face the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Mughals,
All
and
at the same time.
and the various sultanates.
Welcome to episode 2 of my conversations with Shankara Bharadwaj Khandavali. My conversations, as I've always said, are very profound with him. I learn a lot, and hopefully, you all are learning. As you watch these videos, please leave your comments, your questions, things that are not clear to you, and I promise to bring them up in my conversations with him as we go along. In this episode today, episode 2, I want to pick up from where we left off in the last conversation. And we touched upon many things, Shankar. I'd just like to quickly go through them and then pick them on one at a time. One very powerful insight you shared yesterday was that Bharatvarsha, India, was behaving like we Indians were behaving like an organism as a response to the invasion starting in 636 AD, the Arab, Turkic, Islamic invasions. And behaving like an organism, Goswami Tulsidas elevating Ram to invoke Hindus' Kshatriya Dharma, the Johars, the preservation, while North was being invaded, preservation of
The knowledge in the south.
Knowledge in the south, Khalsa Panth, Hindu Swaraj, all of these were very, very powerful. And it brought a memory of Sanjeev Sanyal's complex adaptive systems, which are constantly sort of mutating to adapt to the environment around. So that was very powerful. I'd like to talk about the sheets of Hindu Dharma. You said the Shankaracharya Mathas, it's not their job to try and do Gharvapsi or such thing. Their job is to preserve. So I'd like to understand what these sheets are and touch upon, say, Naga Sadhus, for example, which supposedly is the outermost of the Sadhu Samaj. And then actually before that, maybe the third part is we'd like to go and talk about the invasions into India once again, the number of invasions from your blog on India Facts, and the fact that, bringing up again Abhijit Iyer's calling out the Varna system, birth-based over merit, while the Mongols and then the Turkic Mongols were actually breaking rules and bringing merit-based people into their fighting forces, while we were still stuck with Varna and birth-based. So, and after that, then we'll do another topic. So wherever you want to start from, let's maybe start from the behaving like an organism, and if you'd like to touch upon, or shall we go to the last
maybe
part
we
first?
can pick the last part first is fine.
Awesome, let's do that. And I'll pull up your blog as well.
So the number of invasions is one indicator. Basically, what I would say is, do we appreciate the magnitude of challenge we were facing? And that, I would say, we tend to oversimplify the complexity and magnitude of the problem. And this is only one indicator of that. Let us say the number of invasions we had seen. Let's say 5 invasions by 650 already.
Yeah.
And by 700, by 700 maybe 12 So basically, in the 7th century, we had seen more than 10 invasions already, which probably not many societies had already withstood by then.
By then, they had probably collapsed. Persia had
Exactly.
probably collapsed also already. And I'm not even sure without any resistance.
Persian collapse is slightly prolonged, but still
Later.
it fell by the time Afghan fell, Persia had already definitely fallen.
Okay.
But when Afghan fell, it was already 3 centuries of struggle we had already put up by then.
So that is Persia fell, you're saying about 900,000.
No, I don't remember the exact timeline of Persia falling, because they also took their time to resist and retreat, all these things. But that whole story was finished by then, definitely.
Yeah, I heard that 50 years it took for after the conquer, 50 years, and all of it was converted to Islam.
Exactly. Whereas the Afghan region still, once the Afghan region fell, then rest of the regions, then the northwest, there the fortifications started building up, and the Rajputs came, then the Khalsa came, lot of defenses came, which probably suit the nature of the invader at that time. So it's, if we take a long time scale and observe, we can easily see that we had been responding in kind to the nature of the attacks that were coming, nature of challenges. So in that sense, yes, it is an evolutionary organism, which we have always been. I mean, people from life systems background easily understand this evolution and how we develop immunity to certain challenges that are prevalent at certain time, which also bring in certain handicaps in some other spheres of life. Once you become physically strong, your probably some of the soft functions will suffer, which had also happened at that time. Let's say if we take North India, a lot of soft functions, synthetic functions had suffered, which is understandable, which functions have actually moved down to the south. So yeah, it is a overall, if we see, it is a organism. And
like what had suffered, for example, the building of temples, or what
yeah, aesthetics, knowledge function, the soft role usually played by women and children. Now they had to be physically protected, so their prevalence in the public sphere had come down in a very prominent way. The parda, all these things have happened. Then marriages have started happening much earlier, and marriage styles themselves have changed.
Yeah, I wonder about these night marriages. Was that
exactly? Yeah,
was that a response?
Yes, that was also one of the responses, reactions to the nature of. And then obviously the sati kind of thing, more extreme measures that women had to take, the jawhar, all these things. So if so many kinds of reactions had to be created, one big thing we usually don't mention is the Gorak Sampradaya, the Hatha Yoga, if we see. The Gorak Sampradaya came exactly around that time, after the invasions have started. And its footprint is all over the North India, into the Nepal, that Goraknath Sampradaya, and then we have that Gorakhpur, Gorakhmat, all these things. And it has a very big footprint in the North India. In fact, if I am right, the Goraks are the Rajaguru of the Nepal. Also, I don't recall exactly, but I hear that. But definitely we know the Gorkha comes from Gorak.
I didn't know that. Okay.
So their span and spread and impact has been much bigger. This, if you see Gorak as a tradition, it is its own tradition. Right?
Okay, I didn't even know that.
It is its own tradition, and it has its own impact at different layers. The innermost sheath of that tradition itself happens to be the Hatha Yogis and the sadhus, which actually synthesize the knowledge, the techniques of yoga, all this. So the deep knowledge is there in the innermost sheath. And then you have a slightly outer sheath, or the kosha, the next kosha, where you have people who are spreading that kind of knowledge, going into the society. And then you have people who are furthermore activist, probably less connected to the root, but at the same time part of the same tradition. So this is how in general traditions work, right? Even if you take the Shankara Pitha, or Ramanuja's Matha or any Uttaradi Matha of the Madhvas. They have this innermost core. Then you have knowledge invested but not centered, people who generate knowledge. Second layer, these kind of people generate knowledge that is more relevant for the society and less relevant for the permanent system. Let us say that Mahasthanas or the Vedangas or that kind of knowledge. That is one sheet. Then you have the external one where your Dharma Shastras, all these come in. People who are more in touch with the kings, let us say, or in the society, they know the trends that are happening at this time. They are the ones who actually contribute more to that level of knowledge. And then you have people who are awakening the society, who are actually picking people from the society who are capable of working with these kind of people and who live their own dharma. Let us say the people who are day to day doing the Agnihotra, they are preserving the knowledge, they are preserving the traditions. These people, actually, the Gruhastha is ideally the main responsible one to protect dharma, right? It's not the sadhus, but sadhus are helping these people, but their source of knowledge right now is coming from these pitas. So, in that sense, the Gruhastha has now become, a third level where he is actually deriving knowledge. But some people, very few committed people, are actually implementing it in their day-to-day life and preserving that kind of dharma, which is itself now, unfortunately, a minuscule minority. Then you have more people doing sadhanas, their own elevation in life, all this. So at several levels this happens. At 2-3 levels further down, you will see people who are engaging actively in terms of polemics and synthesizing knowledge that is required to counter the attacks, intellectual onslaughts. Let us say critique of defending any critique of dharma, or actually doing a critique of the Abrahamic traditions, all these things.
But I mean, I would argue that everyone, maybe I don't know if the inner sheath was doing that, but for example, the conversations with Adi Shankaracharya and Mandan Mishra, true to the Purva Paksh tradition, actually learned everything about Buddhism, if you like, and then critiqued it. I mean, people blame Shankaracharya for fall of Buddhism, but actually, perhaps I've also heard there was probably Mandan Mishra who was.
It was Kumarila.
Kumarila
has demolished already by the time Shankara came. So that story is there. No, I mean, he jumped out of a cliff saying, if Veda is the truth, then I would come out, safe and all that. Then he lost an eye.
Okay, I don't know the story.
As he jumped off. And then basically he defeated the Buddhists. The Buddhists actually realized that this fellow knows too much about us. Who is he really? An insider or an outsider? So, and then because he did a Guru Droha, basically he lied to his Guru and then learnt Bauddha. He did a Prayaschitta. So he immolated himself with that in a slow process. By the time he went into the pyre, that's when Shankara comes and he says, I want to argue with you. Then Kumarila reads through the Vartikas, the Bhashya that Shankara has written. He feels very happy. If I had not already gotten into the stage, I would have probably written my own commentary on what you have done. But now it's too late. So now you can go and argue with my disciple Mandana. Yeah, by that time, Bauddha had been already countered. Shankara did his own counter, but it's often attributed to him without his. Shankara's main contribution is more constructive, I would say. He had actually brought together, systematized into those 6 Shanmatas and then the Shankara Pithas, all these things. So he has organized a lot of things at that time which were scattered and given a structure which is probably alive today.
Okay. So going back, isn't that then the inner sheath, if you like, wasn't Mandan Mishra part of the inner sheath who was actually doing arguing and So you mentioned something earlier about people understanding the other, writing a critique or doing a critique of the other traditions, for
Yeah,
example.
so there we'll need to understand the nature of the problem and then the nature of the solution. If Christianity had been purely an intellectual culture which appreciates criticism, if the Pope is honest enough to say that if I am defeated in a debate, I am going to leave Christianity, then that makes sense. Then you would expect a Shankarapita head to go and argue with him. But the Abrahamics never have that honesty, right? I mean, they are not basically about truth. They are about faith and their proclamation of what they already know as truth. So there is no meaningful engagement that can happen with them. Then why do you even expect them, these people, to engage in such a thing? So this is not known even today, and not just today. It was known back then. Vidyaranya himself did not do because he knows the nature of the enemy. He knows there is no point in writing such a critic. That has to be done by, as I said, 3-4 levels down. The polemicists like Sitaram Goel, it is their brief actually. It is not the brief of Shankarapithas to do such a critic. Political critic is not expected from the Shankarapithas. These are basically socio-political ideologies which need a political critic. Yeah, their worldview is coming. You need to understand that. For that, yeah, the knowledgeable people are required.
So who is fulfilling that Vidyaranya role in today's society? We have a lot of criticism for the Kathavachaks, for example. I mean,
Correct.
they are the people who are in touch with, or taking the Shastras and the Puranas and taking them to people in village level, gaon level, everything. And they are only talking about wonderful ahimsavadi things and bhakti and all of this. Even the bhakti, I find, I don't know, very
The intoxicating type.
very subduing, if you like. It is one of resignation. I don't know if we were always like that. I mean, in North India, in Delhi and Haryana belt, especially, Shankara, there are many cars, you write labels or at the back of your car screen. Many times the whole thing is about surrender has become resignation. It has become Dukhyare ka palanhar would be, I don't know, something Krishna Murari
Yeah, so
Hamara.
as Vivekananda Swami says, no, this is tamas, this is not actually sattva as you think.
Okay.
He had actually fallen into inaction thinking that this is some kind of nobility.
Yeah.
So yeah, where there is requirement for active action, so that's the role that the scholars have to play. Few have actually done, but yeah, we expect a lot more to happen, or we need a lot more to happen in that sphere.
Who will do it then? Who will? Where is this layer? Where is this sheath of the Brahmins or the Sadhu Samaj? The Kathavachaks are not doing it. Well, who should we expect this
they
from?
won't. That's what. So the likes of Sitaram Goel, it's basically people in the society who understand this problem.
So what's the responsibility? What's the responsibility of the Sadhu Samaj then? Is there no responsibility on them? I mean, there are sheets there. I understand your argument is that the Shankara Pithas, that's not their responsibility. That is preservation of the core values of what?
Okay, so the answer is not in one step. We will need to work out several steps to get to a real solution. Okay. Step one, basically, we need to build a second sheath around the Shankara Pithas, which is actively engaged in understanding this knowledge and applying that to the society.
This existed earlier, it is not existing anymore?
Correct.
Okay, this would be examples of.
So let us say examples like today you want to synthesize knowledge for governing our society. You need to understand the social institutions. You need to generate a constitutional document. You need to generate a political philosophy. You need an Arthashastra. So this whole kind of knowledge, where is it going to come from? This is going to come from people who are in touch with the social trends, who understand not 50 years, but understand 1,000, 200,000 years of the trends.
So this is the Rajgurus, this is the Chanakya.
Exactly. So your next few hundred years, how is it going to be, and what kind of knowledge and what are the subjects we need to synthesize. New subjects have to develop. So that kind of knowledge generation can happen from people who are as rooted in the inner sheath, at the same time in touch with the world. Now, what happened is tradition has gone into an ICU. It has completely gone into a preservation mode. Synthesis has died down. That's the main problem statement I would make, which I keep saying earlier also. Once this generation happens, I mean, because Hindu society's main feature, if you would like to say, as Sri Aurobindo also says, is synthesis. We have synthesized the Gorak, we have synthesized the Khalsa. I mean, just imagine when you're facing the peak of invasions, somebody creates a stream of yoga called Hatha Yoga. How is it going to come from? That kind of synthesis of deep knowledge has to happen. From there, you will see more solutions that are suitable for today and tomorrow. So solutions suitable given the wherewithal, given the resources and the muscle that the opponents have, you are not going to be able to generate your kinds of responses with brawn or demographics. You are going to be able to generate this kind of solutions only if that deep knowledge is there, which we are ignoring repeatedly and undermining its value. So the day we understand that Veda and Shastra or the Vedamata's knowledge is the knowledge, permanent knowledge, which can generate timely solutions for the coming millennium, and we start synthesizing those subjects, from there we will automatically generate the third level of knowledge, which includes the polemics and intellectual responses to attacks. So it's not going to directly come from first level knowledge. And this knowledge has to align with the ground movements. I mean, right now, the ground movements are doing their own thing, and there is a separate bunch of intellectuals sitting in their, their place, they are doing their work. These are two separated. In a collective organism, they should work together. That's what you expect. There is no intellectual cover given to the ground movements.
And that's why it's all emotional. It is all about rage.
Exactly. And look at the intellectual cover given to the Naxalites by the communists. So that is how a collective organism would work. I mean, although you don't have to draw a moral contrast between them, but just comparing the dynamic. So to some extent, probably a thankless job of that is done by Conrad Hals. He tries to defend the ground movements, Saffron Swastika and such books, but we don't see much of it from.
So this is where Shankar Sharanji, Conrad Hals, I don't know, possibly even intellectually, people like Sanjeev Sanyal. Yes.
Yeah. That would be that layer.
Your work, while you humbly keep yourself out.
So yeah, coming back on the actually nature of invasions and the response, right? The other point is the magnitude of attack. The number of invasions, the complexity, and the damage done by each successful invasion, that actually overweighs on us. Let us say that Panipat battle was there. People think Panipat had basically destroyed us and that was the end of the story. But that was not true, right? I mean, after that, we had rebuilt. Marathas had defeated British also. And at that time, Marathas had to face the British, the French, the Portuguese, and the Mughals,
all
and
at
the various
same time.
And the various sultanates,
all the Nizams,
Oudh, Bengal, Mysore. So I mean, just imagine one Marathas doing all this at the same time, and then we try to put something just to rationalize their defeat. We say they were not strategic enough for this or that. I mean, all kinds of fault finding. What they had done is a superhuman effort, which probably nobody else would have been able to do. And each of these empires, how big was the British Empire in 1750s? If you just look at the map, what is the resource base they had? We only count the number of British people inside India, which is not meaningful. They had sufficient resource base to generate the kind of sophisticated attack which they could at that time. Whereas we were defending our land against all these people. I mean, Portuguese had basically captured Goa and it took a lot of effort to recapture Vasai itself. I mean, we lost a lot of army at that time. So the cost of each victory, cost of each defeat, this is not just a matter of tactic or strategy. Obviously, people there who were fighting, they had fairly high IQ. They were very smart people. But we just oversimplify the magnitude and complexity of the problem we had at that time. And the capture of the seas. How much resource base did we have to get the trade done and reap the results of our trade? We were a century earlier, we were actually doing a lot of trade. We were very rich. But then that had actually shrunk because of the global situation. I mean, a lot of attacks happened and people had actually captured a much bigger part of that share of that trade. So Marathas practically had to survive on the Chowth or the taxation. Chowth is also not, that was a crisis measure tax, right? I mean, ideally what Chanakya prescribes is not 25% tax.
10% only.
Yeah.
1/10.
So this was a crisis tax, which we need to understand, which had to be done at that situation. And society got feudalized at that time. I mean, a lot of people, while all this military success is attributed to the Peshwas, at the same time, during the same Peshwas, society got very feudalized because these people started incentivizing the zamindars, all these people, the middlemen, to extract more tax. Whoever was doing that. So a lot of dynamics are involved there. All this could have been undone if we had sufficient time and self-governance. But there was nothing to undo, right? Immediately British came and they have deepened that feudalism instead of removing that, because that was incentivizing for their loot. So whatever India is feudal, all these things date directly to that situation, that crisis that was created by the same British.
Okay.
So again, coming back, is it all lack of intelligence? Obviously, it is not lack of intelligence. It was just that the problem is too big for you and you had done whatever was possible for you within your limited capacity.
So one thing I keep hearing is, of course, all the treachery and all of that, even with the Vijayanagar Empire, for example, when it was winning, of course, there were some Muslim, cavalry, I believe, which are turned against because they wanted to side on the side of Islam versus the royalties there. And also, but there were some brothers or some distant relatives which turned away. So minus that, one is the treachery which gets blamed a lot, from Jaichand to right down to, say, Vijayanagar, or even Sambhaji Maharaj's arrest, his capture, his leading to his capture. But that apart, there is another. So 2 points, right? One, like Abhijit Iyer was saying, that birth-based Varna. Do you have a point there? And the second part is about Hindu confederations. Other than one confederation, I believe, of the Bundelis and the Rajputs, I'm not too sure. I think 3 or 4 kingdoms or Janapadas, kingdoms, I would guess, got together and invaded Kabul, which was actually way beyond their territorial whatever to win it back. This is after, if I'm not wrong, in the 800s.
Correct.
So I mean, these 2 points, I mean, there weren't enough Hindu confederations, enough of them getting together and saying, this is part of our land and we are going to go and invade. So do you have a point on that? I tried to bring it up.
So that again is like comparing with respect to what we understand today. Confederations have happened because people had that commitment. There was no political union. So whatever was done, they did because they saw the need. So today, how much are the states cooperating on any pandemic or any crisis, or even forget pandemic, even water? They are fighting with each other. You have a political union, still states are bickering. States are bickering on language, on water, on everything. That was a time when people cooperated without having a political union. So first, draw this contrast. We need to get our perspective on what we should expect from what times.
And is this also unrealistic? Because it's not that the invaders who were coming in were all confederations.
Exactly.
They were also
That's what our
marauders who
expectation.
basically were winning over each other and gathering more force and coming in badgering.
Yes. So that expectation is itself meaningless. But at the same time, in spite of that, people had actually created confederations, much more in number than we read in the textbooks, obviously. There was one confederation that Yashodharma had built. There was one that Bhoja had built. There was one again, I don't recall it, who it was, but a confederation was silently formed. The enemy was allowed to come as far as Puri, and then the whole army was massacred.
Oh, wow.
And then Marathas actually unified a lot. I mean,
Yes.
for all the credit we deny them,
Yes.
in spite of not having a political union.
Yeah, it was a revelation for me when I read The Land of Seven Rivers. I mean, honestly, that book was the transformation for my personal journey of the, I don't know, the association with this land, if you like. When I saw the Maratha map or the territories that Marathas ruled, even as confederations within them,
Exactly.
feudal confederations, was larger than the political entity that is India at this point in time. It was shocking. Attak to Kattak.
Exactly. Yeah. Except Afghan region, probably they ruled most of India, barring three sultanates: the Oudh, the Bengal, and the Mysore. And
Right.
these three were the rogue players that eventually caused our fall to British.
Oh, I don't know this story.
I mean, we don't see it that way. We attribute that whole victory and loss to Marathas. They lost, they won. But the foul play that happened by these three needs to be correlated with what actually happened at that time. Marathas were fighting the Mysore. At the same time, they were fighting the British. Why did they have to fight Mysore? Because Tipu was actually massacring and converting Hindus. They had to stop that. So the Peshwas had to invest a lot of army to basically bend Tipu down to at least come to a pact where he will say, I will stop massacring. And that happened at the peak of the time when Marathas were defending their life against the British. So, but who has actually taken this native perspective and seen this from this side? That's the main problem. We try to get too neutral about this matter and say that they have lacked this perspective, all that.
Yeah, we were trying to whatever create
Infighting and all that.
Yeah, infighting and breed horses, trying to copy and not. That was the argument made, that we were trying to copy and breed horses, Arabic horses, while the infantry, and not looking at our strength of infantry. That was a very.
But how are you going to fight an invasion force without having proper counters to it? Obviously, we knew the strengths that we had, but again, going back to the lack of asymmetric warfare, we were basically believing in symmetric warfare, so we did not have siege weaponry. Siege weaponry was available right adjacently in China. Mongols had taken siege weaponry from China.
Siege weaponry, and help me understand.
The battering rams, all these things that you use to attack the fortifications, that they had actually taken from China. And then the same similar siege weaponry gets applied on our fortifications. Did we not? Why did we not? Because we didn't have a concept of asymmetric warfare. We don't actually go kill people in the night and all that. So that is there. But at the same time, after all this happened, we did develop it. It's not that we just left it and said we will go down fighting just because our war ethics say that. The Rajputs and Marathas did take the guns. They did use their siege weaponry eventually when they fought the enemies. At that time, when the attacks initially came, we did not have it because of our war ethics. Once it came to this, they eventually learned that also. So our war ethics did not stop us from picking things that were really useful for our survival.
Okay,
So,
how little credit we give to the Marathas, and how we, I don't know, put a lot of the others on a pedestal for saving Hindus is just.
And because we see all these as scattered battles. We don't see all these battles as part of one grand war that we were fighting. I mean, only very lately that 27-year war got coined, but
Yes.
that is also part of a very big picture. And Maratha, actually, once since you said that birth by, I mean, Varna by birth and all that, Maratha was the time when actually the Varna really collapsed, I would say, because that was the time when the Brahmin actually took up the Kshatra and Vaishya professions at a big scale. The Peshwas and all these people, and the Sahukar profession also.
But weren't there kingdoms, sorry to interrupt your thought, but weren't there large kingdoms being built much before that, where, if I'm not wrong, the Gurjar Pratihars were Shudras, or maybe I'm wrong about that, but there was some empire like swathing across much before that. Very large empires which were.
So the Magadha history, if you see from Mahabharata to 0 AD, majority of the lineages were Shudra.
Okay. So then why would we say that Varna got completely, broken down much later?
Okay, there are two parts to the problem. One part of the problem is we think Varna is a system, it's an organization. It is not an organization. I had explained it else in the institutional structure from the micro to macro. Varna is more macro. Varna is there at the Rita, and it operates as a dharma within every being. If you are to, how would I say that? Varna is about 3 gunas, right? Basically, by 3 gunas, the guna and karma, Varna comes.
Okay.
So it is not as if every group is given certain Varna at every time and all that. It is basically by your survival fitness, whatever you do, that activity can be belonging to certain Varna. But it's not that you are assigned something and then you do that kind of work. This is the exact reverse of what we perceive about the society.
Yeah, we'll talk in detail about this in one of the.
Yeah. So as people, let us say, as any group took up warfare to defend the society, or because they became influential and they became kings or whatever, there could be two reactions from society. Either they are elevated to Kshatra, because Kshatra is not just about fighting wars. Kshatra is about, do you have that intellectual and Vedic training? Kshatra is more of an intellectual function than a physical function. We had the Rajarshis, all these people. So only if you have that level of training and elevation, you can be called a Kshatriya. Every fighter is not a Kshatriya. So in the past, in the Magadha or in various parts, we had that leisure where the Brahmins invested in these people to elevate them to Kshatriya status. It took a few decades to few centuries for that to happen. And under invasions, such leisure was not there. So these fighters, warrior groups, did not all become Kshatriya they did not become Kshatriya automatically. They were doing only one small part of what Kshatra demands. The other functions of Kshatra were not fulfilled by them. It is not, so take Prolaya Vemareddy. He proudly called himself a Shudra. He was content with that. He did protect the Brahmins. He did create a kingdom. But he himself did not get his own lineage to a point where they can be really called Kshatriyas. They are trained in Vedas and they can actually envisage kingdoms that can establish Dharma in a proper way. So there is a lot of gap between just fighting and getting there. That leisure we need to, today maybe we have that leisure, we should invest in such activity so that we generate real Kshatriyas. So that's one aspect. And the birth thing is absolute nonsense, as you said. I mean, I would take usually the example of rishis and the kings. Kings, obviously, we know kings came from all groups at all times, not just 5000 BC or 19th century. It happened always. Rishis is the other thing. We had a Brahmana Rishi like Vasishtha. We also had a Rishi coming from the so-called ST kind of groups like Matanga. That happened in the past, not just past. the most caste-ridden times of our so-called caste-ridden times of our society, 19th, 20th century, the rishis that we had, they came from all groups. It's not that they were only Brahmins. Did any Brahmin question Vivekananda's caste before saying, I revere him? Or Aurobindo? They were people from much lower groups also. Point is, society always had this nobility to honor people of character, people of knowledge. We are attributing things to society by looking at society from an outsider's perspective. You look at it as an insider, you will understand how noble the society itself is.
Beautiful.
Then the problems are there. Problems, but we need to understand the nature of the problem. If there is an untouchability, if there is a feudalism, where does it come from? And how do you solve it? You should not attack the society, you should attack the problem, right? You should treat the disease, not the patient. And the origin of the problem obviously is, we forget a basic dynamic. If society prospers, every group prospers. If society is oppressed, its space is removed, it is impoverished, all groups suffer to different extents. Maybe more survival groups suffer less survival fit groups suffer more. That is the basic dynamic. It is not because one group is an enemy of the other group or trying to oppress the other group. So this dynamic, if we see, this is a natural dynamic. We will understand it if we see this society as a collective organism. We can easily see that some groups have suffered more and some have suffered less. But all these groups have fought the outsider. They did not fight each other. There was no caste conflict in India before 19th century. All groups fought shoulder to shoulder. They fought the outsider.
Yeah, including the much maligned Mahars.
Exactly.
Fighting with the British against the Marathas. That was a much later phenomenon. But
so again, citing this as a reason for lack of unity is also absolutely meaningless. No society had as much unity as we had. Society has always generated collective responses of diverse forms. It's not possible unless society thinks as a collective organism. The birth and karma, I mean, this guna and karma are the two determinants of varna. To repeat, it has so many factors. There is birth factor, there is an environment factor, there is a upbringing factor, there is an opportunity factor. So many factors come together to determine this. And nobody says you have to do this because you come from this varna. It is the other way around. You do this, you are like this. Therefore, your varna could be this. And that is not a qualifier for you to do something. Throne is not denied to a Kshatriya, to a Shudra because he is a Shudra, right? He showed that capability, he won it by power.
Sorry?
So a throne, a kingdom is not denied to a Shudra just because he is that. He showed that power, he showed that capability, he got that throne. Where did that ever get stopped? Nowhere in the entire history. It is true, the Brahmins would have refused to do certain Abhisheka to somebody, certain Upanayana to somebody. That is a different factor. That is basically to do with the samskara and the evolution and all these things, which is true in its own place and relevant in its place.
So the refusal to make Shivaji Chhatrapati, that happened by the Pune Brahmins, if I recall correctly. They refused to do that. Then
but there was both sides. No, eventually he got coronated.
Yes, but somebody had to travel from Kashi to actually do his coronation.
So those things happen. I mean, there is always that difference of opinion. The point is that difference is honored. It was never like there is only this is the rule book and you can't violate this. Let's say Baji Rao's own son, Krishna Kumar, they refused to do the Upanayana. He became that Shamsher and all that.
Because of the Mastani.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's not a loyalty question. They knew him. They put him in their own army. He was having a good position. All these things were there side by side with the fact that his Upanayana was not done. So we need to understand they could be our people. At the same time, that does not mean they qualify for something that they don't. While you can always debate on that qualification part, that is why both sides of the argument are there. That does not deny the fact that they were still insiders and seen as insiders.
I think we've covered all of the topics, the three topics that I had in mind, picking up from the earlier conversation. Barring maybe a very quick point, maybe on the Bhakti movement, and in particular Goswami Tulsidas, and the point about bringing Ram to the fore. That was important. It was an important point. And generally, if you can talk about the Bhakti movement a little bit, as I'm guessing that was also one of the societal response to.
It was.
Yeah.
It was. So as the knowledge function had declined, let us say, in South, actually, the Pralay Vimareddy, a few people, actually, the Kondavidu, some empires had small kingdoms, had created these agraharas where Veda Vidyas could be pursued, and they protected that to some extent. But in the north, there was much more damage physically done to the learning process. So because of this, what happened was the intellectual knowledge generation had declined. Only knowledge had slowly started entering the preservation phase. And preservation phase, nothing survives, right? I mean, timely knowledge is required. I mean, there were things like Hatha Yoga, all these things had come. But what was more feasible to be taken into people so that the spirit of the society survives? That was bhakti. So its relevance and importance cannot be exaggerated. It was absolutely essential at that time. But everything has a side effect. Everything comes with a compromise. The compromise was the knowledge function, intellectual activity. So yeah, the Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, if that moment had not come, what would have happened? You would have actually seen much more conversions, much more aggressive poaching, and we would have lost our society in a bigger way. So the physical preservation had actually happened through the bhakti. Preservation of knowledge had happened through these, these specific traditions, Shankara Pithas, all these people taking up that responsibility when the Grihastha was unable to do that dharma at that time because of the prevailing situation.
The Bhakti saints were probably the second sheath around the.
Exactly, and they were the saviors in that sense. Bhakti also is not a monolith. Bhakti, actually, Ramanuja also advocated Bhakti, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also advocated Bhakti. So, if we see Ramanuja's own thing, he had given a lot of preference to or priority to action, to Bhakti, to knowledge, everything. So, there were several sheets on which he was operating at the same time. Goswami Tulsidas probably tried to take it more into the people where people can, they chant the Ramayana by themselves. They can relate to Rama. Everybody relates to Rama in this land. So that was the right time. Probably a few centuries here or there, Potana in South did that translation of Bhagavata, which is popular to this day, which was also instrumental in keeping that man-God relation, if you want to say. That was instrumental in.
Yeah, very interestingly, in one lecture by Professor Kapil Kapoor, he talks about how Guru Gobind Singh translated the Bhagavad Puran, and he basically says, Bakha Diyo Banaye, which means I have made it available to the language, in a language which the large mass understands. He was saying that what is this madness you're talking about, that he was a Sikh and Khalsa and non-Hindu? What is this nonsense?
Exactly. I mean, obviously the Khalsa, they never saw themselves obviously Sikh came from the Hindu family, first son becomes a Sikh, all these things. How can you draw two separate lines? We can draw a line in the sense only that in a single family, you could have people from different traditions. The social structure, if you understand, there is a clan, within the clan, there is a family, within the family, you could have people following all kinds of ideologies. One could be a communist, one could be a, capitalist. Similarly, you could have one Vaishnava, one Shaiva in the same family. This actually takes us to another thing, a phenomenon that we need to observe is how the religion and the caste had become intertwined. So if you see Lingayats, for instance, or the Sikhs, they have actually become caste religion units. Earlier, it was purely orthogonal. You could be any religion but any caste, any tradition and any caste. But with these medieval centuries, we see this caste religion intertwining phenomenon, which can be seen in South, in North, I don't know to what extent. This gave some level of cohesion and unity for people to fight as a unit, but it also results in certain level of rigidity.
Yeah, I don't understand this quite well, actually. Actually, I don't understand it at all. They're Lingayats or religion.
Yeah, so Lingayat is a Shaiva.
Yes.
They are Shaivas.
Yeah.
At the same time, you see them as one social unit.
Yes, but caste, or you mean simply like forming a new jati, if you like
Yes.
another caste. Okay.
So they usually they marry among themselves, all these things. They act like one social unit.
Got it. And so the Khalsa were probably
Khatri,
similar. Yes,
yeah.
Khatris.
So this gave certain strength to society at that time. But at the same time, in the long run, it has to eventually dissolve. Otherwise, these become artificial units, and then they lead to other problems. Today, the way Khalsa has served its purpose. I think it's time we actually either rediscover it or dissolve it so that something more synthetic comes in that society. Looking at the current state of Punjab, it is desperately waiting for some such synthetic change.
Yep. Or maybe once again, perhaps with time. I mean, so for example, Kapil Kapoorji calls himself a Sahajdhari Sikh. He says, I'm a Sikh, but I'm a Sahajdhari Sikh. I don't carry a beard and hair and all of that, right? So maybe the slow progressive movement, maybe not visible in a short period of 10-20 years, maybe towards Sahajdhari Sikhs.
Yeah, that transformation is external. What I'm saying is you need another knowledge fillip to it.
Okay.
Like the Hatha Yoga or Khalsa's, what happened was Khalsa at that time, there was some knowledge available and there was physical action required. So they created that kind of system. Today, probably you need another wave of knowledge to say that for tomorrow to be suitable, this group needs this kind of practices, this kind of philosophy and tradition.
But that is at the core of
exactly. Such inner sheath transformation has to happen is what I'm saying.
Yes. So which I find that we, like Sri Sri Ravi Shankar says, that we forget the banana and hold on to the peel, the banana peel all the time. That is what is happening in the Sikh Panth, if you like. And Kapil Kapoorji said very beautifully that, basically Guru Gobind Singh was stabbed in his back by a Pathan. And he had nobody to pass on the baton to. He basically said, now your Guru, I can't appoint another Guru, the Guru Granth Sahib will be your Guru. Now he didn't mean the book. He didn't mean...
He meant the knowledge.
He meant the knowledge in the book, not the written word, not the book. And now, even me, right? I've been brought up with...
See, that's what, that happens with every tradition. That is why we have this ecosystem where there is a life cycle. So we know there are several traditions actually. There was one Harihara Advaita which came when the Shaivaya Vaishnava were fighting bitterly. This Harihara Advaita had actually played an instrumental role in dissolving that poison.
Very beautiful.
The rivalries.
You mentioned this earlier.
But at the same time, it served the purpose and it had dissolved into the ecosystem. Today, there is no such tradition. So everything has to do its thing and die, right? I mean,
yeah. So I guess the Vedantin ideas, the Advaitic ideas, which are core to Sikhism, need to come to the fore. Which essentially, so once again, Professor Kapil Kapoor, he says actually, Sikhi or the Sikh tradition, Sikh Panth is nothing but Advaitic. It is truly Vedantic in nature. So
it is. So yeah, go back to that knowledge and synthesize and go to the root. You can create other forms. You don't need to stick to the forms. And people also tend to gravitate towards new forms anyway. It's not as if now the problem is the new things are not visible for them to gravitate. We need to keep creating. Synthesis is what, as again Aurobindo says, as synthesis keeps happening, the society will be more vibrant and alive. And that synthesis today is missing because we are not connecting to the innermost sheath to develop that knowledge. And that is where their role is.
Okay, very profound once again. How do we build this layer of people? It has to come out of, my guess is, initiatives like at the political level, perhaps the Rashtraman School of Leadership, for example, or but the spiritual, this layer, this sheath, which is able to connect to the core and as well as with the outside. How do we go about building that? That's the effort. Okay.
But yeah, I mean, state that as the requirement or the problem, then ways will come out.
Then ways will come out.
So far, we are not stating that as the missing link.
Very good.
We are either putting the problem either on the inner sheath or on the outer sheath.
Yes.
With this.
Very good. Very, very profound. Thank you very much, Shankar. We'll end this episode of the conversation here, and we'll pick up another conversation very shortly. Thank you very much.